What would you do if someone told you the child you had mourned for 12 years was alive? Before we go any further, hit that like button right now and subscribe to this channel, because what you are about to watch is unlike anything that has ever happened on Family Feud. Steve Harvey has seen joy on this stage. He has seen heartbreak. He has seen families win money and families win far more than money. But on one afternoon in the winter of 2024, he said 4 words to a man that collapsed 12 years of grief in a single breath. 4 words. And the man who heard them will tell you, to this day, that his life divided itself into everything before that moment and everything after. There are stories about loss, and there are stories about what loss does to a person over years. How it becomes not a wound but a weather, something you live inside, rather than something that happened to you. Walter Hines had been living inside that weather for 12 years. He had made peace with it, the way you make peace with something you cannot change. He had rebuilt around it. He had continued. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in Burbank, California, Steve Harvey looked at him across a game show stage and said, "Look again." Walter Hines was 63 years old, a retired high school history teacher from Louisville, Kentucky, who had spent 30 years in the classroom doing what good history teachers do, showing young people that the past was not a fixed, finished thing but a living argument that still had something to say about who we were and how we got here. He was a broad-shouldered man who had gone silver at the temples in his early 50s and had the particular unhurried quality of someone who had learned, through necessity, that most things could be waited out. He had been a father twice. His daughter, Keisha, was 36 now, a physical therapist in Cincinnati, practical and warm, the kind of person who organized family holidays and remembered everyone's food allergies. She had signed the family up for Family Feud as a birthday gift for Walter. He had turned 63 in October, and Keisha had decided, with the benevolent authority that eldest children sometimes assume in families that need organizing, that they were going to do something together, and they were going to have fun, and that was simply what was going to happen. His son, Marcus, had been 24 years old when he disappeared. That was the word Walter used when he spoke about it, which was rarely and carefully disappeared. Not the word the police had used in the early weeks, which was missing. Not the word some of his well-meaning colleagues had eventually started using, which was gone. Disappeared, because it preserved the grammatical possibility. However slight, however irrational, however much 12 years of silence argued against it. That disappearing was something a person could reverse. Marcus Hines had been a gifted but restless young man who had inherited his father's intelligence and his mother's stubbornness in proportions that did not always serve him well. He had dropped out of university after 2 years, citing a philosophy he held loosely and confidently in the way that 22-year-olds hold philosophies about the irrelevance of institutional education to lived experience. He had drifted, a word his mother, Darlene, had used with increasing tightness in the jaw as the years passed, through a series of cities and jobs and short-lived plans. He had called home inconsistently. He had promised visits that did not materialize. He had been, in the years before he vanished, becoming a stranger by degrees. Then, one February, the calls stopped entirely. Not gradually, entirely. His phone was disconnected. His last known address, a shared apartment in Portland, Oregon, produced no forwarding information. His friends, to the extent that Walter and Darlene could locate and contact them, said they had not heard from Marcus in weeks. The Portland police opened a missing persons file. There was no evidence of foul play. There was no evidence of anything. Marcus Hines had simply, at the age of 24, ceased to be findable. Walter and Darlene had spent the first 2 years in active, exhausting search mode. Private investigators, national missing persons registries, the particular internet archaeology that grieving parents perform in the small hours of the night when the house is quiet and the mind will not stop working. They had found nothing. The 3rd year had been the hardest, because it was the year they had begun, silently and separately, to consider the possibility that the search was over and that what they were waiting for now was a different kind of news. Darlene had died of a stroke 7 years later, at 59. Younger than she should have been, in Walter's private accounting, in a way that he connected to the specific weight of unresolved grief on a body. He did not say this to doctors. He said it to himself, in the quiet kitchen of a house that had once held 4 people and now held 1. Keisha had been the one who kept going. She had never closed the file in her mind, the way Walter had eventually allowed himself to. She had continued, quietly and with the methodical patience of a healthcare professional who understood that outcomes sometimes took longer than anticipated, to check the national missing persons databases once a month. She had registered her own DNA with 3 separate platforms. She had updated Marcus's entry in the National Registry every year on the anniversary of his disappearance. 8 months before the Family Feud taping, a match had come back on one of the DNA platforms. It was a partial match, close enough to indicate a first-degree relative, flagged automatically by the platform's algorithm. The matching profile had been submitted 18 months earlier under the name Michael Hines. The account had a contact email. Keisha had sent a message at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, sitting at her kitchen table in Cincinnati with her heart going at a speed she had not anticipated, and had waited. The reply had come 4 days later. It was measured and careful and, in the way of someone who had spent a long time being careful, said very little while confirming everything. The person who wrote it acknowledged the match. He said he had been living under a different name for most of the past decade. He said he had left because he had been in a place, at 24, that he had not known how to explain to anyone who loved him, and that leaving had seemed, at the time, like the only way to survive. He said he had thought about reaching out for years. He said he had not known how. His name was Marcus. He was 36 years old. He was alive in Albuquerque, New Mexico, working as a landscape architect. He was, in every way that mattered, the son Walter Hines had lost and never stopped, in the most private, defended corner of himself, looking for. Keisha had coordinated everything from that point forward. The production team had been involved since the beginning, with a therapist on call throughout. Marcus had agreed to the appearance after weeks of careful conversation with Keisha, agreed because she had told him, quietly and without pressure, that their father was 63 years old and had lost their mother and had continued, as he always had, and that a person only had so many chances to sit in the same room as someone who loved them unconditionally. Walter knew he was going on a game show with Keisha and her husband and 2 of his grandchildren. He knew nothing else. The morning of the taping was cold and clear in Burbank. Walter dressed in a navy suit jacket that Keisha had specifically requested he bring, which he had thought was an oddly formal request for a game show but had honored because Keisha was organized and he had learned, over the course of her lifetime, to trust her organizational instincts. He was in good spirits, the easy, unguarded good spirits of a man who is expecting an ordinary pleasant afternoon and has no reason to prepare himself for anything else. In a green room on the other side of the building, Marcus Hines sat with his wife, Claudia, and a producer who had been checking in every 30 minutes to make sure he was all right. He was not quite all right. He was functional, which was different. He had been functional for most of his adult life. Claudia held his hand and did not say very much, because she was a woman who understood the difference between the kind of silence that needed filling and the kind that needed protecting. Marcus had changed in 12 years in the ways that matter, and not changed in the ways that could not be helped. He was broader than he had been at 24. He had a calm that the young man who had vanished had not possessed. Earned, not natural, the calm of someone who had done significant work on himself and had the receipts. He had been in therapy for 6 years. He had rebuilt his relationship with himself before he had allowed himself to consider rebuilding anything else. He had married Claudia 4 years ago. He had told her everything. She had stayed because she was the kind of person who believed that who someone became mattered more than every version of who they had been. He had thought about his father every day for 12 years. Not with guilt, precisely. Guilt implied that he believed he had been wrong to leave, and his therapist had helped him understand that the leaving itself had been, at the time, a survival response rather than a moral failure. What he felt was closer to longing, a persistent, low-frequency longing for the man who had stood at the front of a classroom and taught other people's children that history was alive, while his own son had been nowhere to be found. Steve Harvey opened the show with his customary energy. He introduced the Hines family from Louisville: Walter, Keisha, her husband James, and two of Walter's grandchildren, 11-year-old Amara and 8-year-old Dion, to warm applause. Walter was relaxed and funny in the easy way of a man who spent 30 years managing classrooms and is comfortable in front of an audience. He made a joke about not being nervous that made Steve laugh genuinely. Amara, his granddaughter, informed Steve Harvey with great seriousness that she had been studying the most popular survey answers for 3 weeks. Steve told her she was his kind of people. The opposing family, introduced as the Hines family from Albuquerque, received their welcome. Marcus had positioned himself on the far side of his podium, angled slightly away from Walter's line of sight in the way the production team had suggested, minimizing the risk of recognition before the moment was ready. Walter registered the surname, acknowledged it with a slight tilt of the head, the way you acknowledge a coincidence, and returned his attention to Steve Harvey. The game began. Walter was sharp and engaged, calling out answers with the confident speed of a man who had been mentally playing Family Feud from his couch for 20 years. Amara buzzed in twice, correctly both times, and received the audience's complete adoration. Dion, who was 8, had decided that his primary contribution to the team was enthusiastic noise, which he delivered without restraint. The Hines family from Louisville won the main game. Keisha, standing at her podium, exhaled very slowly. Steve Harvey began the transition to fast money. He called Walter forward to the podium. Walter walked up with the easy confidence of a man who is about to play a game he has practiced and who fully expects, whatever happens, to have a good story to tell at Christmas. Then Steve stopped. He was holding his cue card. He looked at it. He looked at the production booth, where he had been briefed, where the therapist was standing by, where Keisha had made him promise, personally, specifically, that he would find the exact right way to do this. He put the cue card down. He walked toward Walter slowly, stopping a few feet away, and looked at him with an expression that Walter would later describe as the face of a man who is about to hand you something heavy and wants to make sure you are ready. "Walter," Steve said, "I need to ask you to do something for me before we play fast money. I need you to turn around." Walter's easy smile remained in place. "Turn around. I need you to turn around," Steve said again, quietly, "and look at the family on the other side of the stage." Something in the register of Steve's voice reached Walter Hines before his mind processed the words. The smile did not leave his face so much as become uncertain. It stayed in the same position while the certainty behind it quietly withdrew. He turned. The lights in the studio felt, to everyone present, as though they had changed, though the production team would confirm afterward that nothing in the lighting rig had been adjusted. What changed was the attention of 200 people, all of it moving in the same direction at the same moment, carrying with it an almost physical quality of held breath. Walter looked at the family on the other side of the stage. He looked at the broad, shouldered man standing at the far podium, who was now facing him fully, whose face carried 12 years of living in it, who was standing very still in the way of someone who has been still for a long time and does not trust himself to move. The sound Walter Hines made was not a word. It was a sound that had no useful description. It was the sound of a structure giving way, not collapsing, not breaking, but releasing the way a held breath releases, the way a fist opens. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then Walter Hines crossed the Family Feud stage. He did not walk. He moved with the purposeful, conscious urgency of a man who has had 12 years between himself and something and has just been told the distance is gone. Marcus met him halfway, coming out from behind his podium, and the two of them came together in the center of the stage, with the force of two people who had been moving toward each other for a long time without knowing it. Steve Harvey stepped back. He did not speak. The microphone was at his side. He stood with one hand pressed flat against his chest and watched. Keisha had both hands over her face. James had his arm around her. Amara, 11 years old and perceptive enough to understand that something very large was happening even without the full context, took her grandfather's empty spot at the podium and stood there very straight, as though standing at attention for an occasion she recognized as significant. Dion, who was 8, looked at his mother and said, in a stage whisper that carried to the first 3 rows of the audience, "Mom." "Who is that man?" Keisha, not fully composed, said, "That is your uncle, baby." Dion looked at the 2 men holding each other in the center of the stage, then looked back at his mother with the expression of a child recalibrating a world that has just revealed itself to be larger than he thought. "I have an uncle." "You have an uncle?" Keisha said. The audience, 200 people who had arrived that afternoon expecting a game show, was not watching a game show anymore. Several of them were weeping openly. A woman in the second row had her neighbor's hand in both of hers. A man near the back had removed his glasses and was pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes. They were watching something that had no genre, that did not fit into any category of entertainment, that was simply, irreducibly, undeniably, life. Walter and Marcus separated eventually, both of them undone in ways they were not trying to manage. Walter held his son's face in his hands the way a man holds something he thought he had lost and cannot yet fully believe is real. He looked at him for a long moment without speaking. "You look like your mother," Walter said finally. His voice was completely gone. Marcus nodded. He could not speak either. Steve Harvey walked back to the center of the stage. He stood between the 2 men with one hand on each of their shoulders, and he waited another moment before he said anything. Waited until both men had steadied enough to hear him. "Marcus," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to take your time." He paused. "Why did you come today?" Marcus cleared his throat. He looked at Claudia, who had come to stand at the edge of the stage. She gave him the small nod of a woman who has watched her husband prepare for this moment for months. "Because I was a 24-year-old kid who didn't know how to tell his father he was drowning," Marcus said. "And I made the worst choice I could have made, which was to disappear instead. And I spent 12 years building a life I'm proud of, and none of it, felt complete, because the person I most wanted to know about it was the person I had taken myself away from." He stopped. "My sister found me 8 months ago. She could have been angry. She had every right. But the first thing she said was, 'Dad doesn't know,' and I knew then that I had to fix it." Walter looked at Keisha. Keisha, still not fully composed, gave her father the simple, direct look of a woman who has been working on something for a long time and is glad to finally put it in his hands. Steve Harvey addressed the audience and the camera in the way he does when he means every word. "There is a man standing in front of me right now who spent 12 years carrying a grief that he never should have had to carry, and there is a young man standing beside him who spent 12 years carrying something just as heavy, the knowledge of what his silence had cost. Both of them paid for 12 years. And today, on this stage, they are done paying." He looked directly into the camera. "I have been doing this for a long time. And I want to say something to every person watching. If you are carrying something like what Marcus carried, a silence that has grown too large, a distance you don't know how to close, a relationship you walked away from and haven't found your way back to, hear me. The door is not locked from the outside. You are the one holding it closed, and there is someone on the other side who is still there, still waiting, still willing." He paused. "All you have to do is knock." Amara, who had remained at her grandfather's podium throughout all of this with remarkable composure, walked across the stage and took Marcus's hand. She had never met him before that afternoon. She held his hand with the straightforward confidence of a child who has decided, without committee, that someone belongs to her family, and that is simply the situation. Marcus looked down at her. His face did something complicated and then uncomplicated itself into a smile. "Hi," he said. "Hi," said Amara. "I'm your niece. I've been studying for this game for 3 weeks, so you're welcome." The studio laughed, the full, released, whole body laughter of people who had been holding something for a long time and had just been given permission to put it down. Walter Hines laughed too. It was the first time, several people in that audience noted later, that his laughter had reached his eyes since the very beginning of the show. They played the fast money round. Walter, operating on some combination of adrenaline and the particular clarity that arrives on the other side of overwhelming emotion, answered all 5 questions in 17 seconds and scored well enough to win. He would say afterward that he had no memory whatsoever of what any of the questions were. After the taping, the extended family, both sides, all of them, spent the remainder of the afternoon and most of the evening together in a room the production had arranged specifically for this purpose. The therapist checked in regularly. No one needed to be persuaded to stay. No one left early. Walter and Marcus sat together for a long time at a corner table, away from the rest of the family, talking in the quiet, unhurried way of 2 people who have a great deal of ground to cover and have agreed, without saying so, that there is no deadline. Marcus told his father about Albuquerque, the landscape work, the desert light, the particular satisfaction of designing spaces where things could grow. Walter told Marcus about the last years of Darlene's life, carefully and honestly, giving his son the full picture of his mother in her final years, rather than the edited version that grief sometimes produces. Marcus had known his mother was gone. Keisha had told him in one of their early messages, simply and directly, the way Keisha delivered difficult information. He had cried about it alone, in his apartment in Albuquerque, and then had called Claudia and held the phone for a long time without speaking while she stayed on the line. But hearing his father describe her, the small details, the way she still put too much sugar in her coffee, the way she had continued to set 4 plates at the table for almost a year after Marcus disappeared before she eventually stopped, landed differently than the fact of her death had. It landed as loss, specific and particular, the kind that cannot be grieved in the abstract. Walter did not minimize it or soften it. He gave his son the grief alongside everything else, because Marcus was 36 years old and had earned the right to the full truth of his own family. Claudia and Keisha found each other early in the evening and were in deep conversation for most of it. James, Keisha's husband, introduced himself to Marcus with the low, key directness of a man who does not deal in drama, and had long since decided that whatever the outcome of this day, he was going to be straightforward about who he was and see what happened. What happened was that Marcus and James discovered a shared, near-obsessive interest in the history of American urban planning that kept them talking for an hour in a corner while their wives looked at them with the fond exasperation of women who have married men who have extremely specific enthusiasms. Dion spent the evening telling Marcus everything about himself that he considered relevant, which was quite a lot. Marcus listened to all of it with the full attention of a man who understood, with new clarity, that missing 12 years of a family meant he had missed children who were now almost teenagers, and that the fastest way to make up for that was simply to be entirely present for whatever came next. The episode aired 6 weeks later. Within 48 hours, the clip of Steve Harvey saying, "Turn around," had been viewed 80 million times. It was the single most shared piece of television content that week across every platform. News programs covered it. Morning shows replayed it. A columnist for a major national newspaper wrote a piece about what it meant that in an era of manufactured reality television, an unscripted moment of genuine human reunion on a 40-year-old game show had stopped the internet. The answer the columnist arrived at, and that dozens of therapists, family counselors, and ordinary viewers echoed in the days that followed, was simple: people were hungry for real. Not dramatic real, not performed real, but the irreducible realness of a father and a son standing in the same room after 12 years and not knowing what to do with their hands. People recognized it. People needed to see it possible. Walter and Marcus spent Thanksgiving together that year, in Cincinnati at Keisha's house. It was the first Thanksgiving the 4 of them had shared in 14 years. Keisha cooked the same meal their mother used to make. She had the recipes written in Darlene's handwriting in a notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer, and placed it on the table with the matter-of-fact competence of a woman who has been holding the family together for a long time and is glad, finally, to have more people around the table helping to hold it. Marcus sat in the chair where he had sat as a child on family visits, which Keisha had remembered and set out for him without comment. He sat in it and looked around the room at his father, who was telling Dion about some historical event the boy had not asked about, at Amara, who was explaining something to Claudia with the authority of a person 1/3 her age, at James, who was in the kitchen pretending to help while actually staying out of the way, at the family his sister had maintained and grown while he was gone, and felt, not guilt precisely, but a deep and clarifying gratitude for the fact that it had been possible to return. He said as much, later that evening, when the children had gone to bed and the adults were sitting with their coffee around the cleared table. He said he understood that he did not get the 12 years back, that they were gone and the people in this room had lived through them without him, and that asking for anything beyond the present was more than he was owed. Walter set down his coffee cup. "You are my son," he said in the flat, certain voice of a man stating a fact that requires no elaboration. "You were my son when you left, and you were my son the whole time you were gone, and you are my son right now. I am not interested in what you're owed. I am interested in what comes next." The follow-up segment aired 5 months after the original episode. Steve Harvey sat with Walter, Marcus, Keisha, and Claudia in a roundtable that the show had agreed to run without heavy editing. He asked each of them what the experience had changed in them. Keisha said it had changed nothing and everything simultaneously. That the family was the same family it had always been, just complete in a way it had not been, and that completeness turned out to feel different than she had expected. Less dramatic. More like something settling into a shape it was always supposed to have. Claudia said it had confirmed something she had believed about Marcus since the beginnings, that the qualities she loved in him, his patience, his capacity for attention, his refusal to do anything halfway, were not things he had built despite his history, but because of it, and that now that his history was no longer broken, she expected him to be, if anything, even more insufferably thoughtful. Marcus laughed at that. Walter did too. Marcus said the experience had taught him that the stories we tell ourselves about why we cannot go back are almost always less true than we believe them to be, that the door we are convinced is locked is usually just closed, and that the person on the other side has, more often than we dare to hope, been standing close to it all along. Walter spoke last. He was quiet for a moment before he answered, in the way of a man who spent 30 years teaching other people's children to think carefully before they spoke. "Grief is a liar," he said. "It tells you that what is gone completely, that there is no path back, no revision, no chapter after the last one. I believed that for 12 years. I built my life around it, and I was wrong." He paused. "I am not telling you that your grief is lying to you. I am telling you that it might be, and that you owe it to yourself to find out." The Steve Harvey let that sit for a full, unedited moment before he looked at the camera. "If that hit you today, and I believe it hit a lot of you, I want you to do 2 things. The first is for yourself, think about the door you have decided is closed, because it might not be. The second is for this community, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and share this story. Because somewhere out there right now, someone is carrying what Walter carried, and they need to know that the story does not have to end where they think it does. Walter Hines drives to Albuquerque 4 times a year now. He has a standing invitation to the guest room that Marcus and Claudia keep made up specifically for him, with a stack of history books on the nightstand that Marcus puts there because he knows his father will read them. On his last visit, he helped Marcus finish a landscaping project in the backyard, a long raised bed running along the back fence, planted with the heirloom tomato varieties that Darlene used to grow in Louisville. Walter had brought the seeds. He had kept them in a jar in the back of his kitchen cupboard for 7 years, saved from the last summer his wife had tended her garden, waiting for what he could not have told you, but waiting nonetheless. Some things, it turns out, keep until the right time.